Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. The website is aroundtheempire.com. This is listener-supported, independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please help me build up the YouTube channel by subscribing. That's free. youtube.com/c/aroundtheempire. Mark Sleboda joins us today from Moscow to talk about the state of affairs in Ukraine, the Ukraine elections, and the larger geopolitical picture. Mark is an International Affairs and Security Analyst, a U.S. Navy veteran, a university lecturer, and a foreign policy realist. We do a deep dive into the 2014 Maidan, the Euromaidan uprising, an intervention by the U.S., the EU, and NATO, and how Ukraine became the country that it is today. There's an ongoing separatist movement, a civil war, and an economic and ideological break from Russia. But there's been no significant improvement for its citizens, leaving the country with a crisis of confidence, poverty, and corruption. We discuss the three frontrunner candidates in the recent elections: the current president, Poroshenko, the former prime minister, Tymoshenko, and Zelensky, a dark horse, anti-corruption comedian who plays a president on TV on a media channel owned by an infamous exiled oligarch, Kolomoisky. This interview was recorded on the day before the first part of the elections on March 30th, 2019. We now know that Poroshenko and Zelensky will advance to the runoff elections on April 21st. Mark Sleboda, welcome to Around the Empire. Thanks so much for taking some time out of your weekend to talk with me.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on your show.
So, Mark, for our listeners, if you would, tell us a little bit about yourself, because you have an interesting background, and I think you're kind of uniquely qualified to help explain this situation in Ukraine with the elections. And hopefully, if we have some time, we'll also talk about a story that's breaking here, finally breaking here, about Ukrainian involvement in the 2016 elections. So, tell us a little about yourself, if you would.
Okay, I'm born an American. I'm originally from coal country, Pennsylvania. I served in the U.S. Navy for 6 years in the nuclear engineering field. I was a nuclear reactor operator on a warship, basically Homer Simpson on a warship. Minus the donuts at the time. I'm known to like donuts these days. After I got out of the military, I worked for a semiconductor manufacturer as an engineer for a couple of years in Boston, and that's where I met my wife. My wife, Lena, is Crimean. She's Crimean Russian. She was working at the time at the Global HQ. She's in marketing for her company, and we met in Boston. And that was right around the time that George W. Bush became president and started his series of wars. And we decided at the time that we'd rather go and live together in Russia. So I moved to Russia with her, where I started teaching English and a few other subjects, and also started going back to school for international relations. And I studied at probably Moscow's two best schools, the Moscow Institute of International Relations, where all their diplomats are trained, and also at the biggest university in Russia, Moscow State University. Then my wife actually got an offer to go to her new company's Global HQ in London and asked me if I could finish my schooling there. I said, let me take a look. And I ended up finishing and doing my postgraduate work at the London School of Economics in international relations theory and security. Moved back to Russia, and I taught for a few years at Moscow State University. I'm a regular political analyst, say International Affairs and Security Analyst specifically, focusing on Russia and Eurasia and countering U.S. hegemony around the world. And I do that, well, for media outlets all over the world. I'm frequently on RT and Sputnik, Chinese CGTN and Press TV. But I've been on outlets including BBC, France 24, Sky News, South African media, Indian media, Pakistani media, just pretty much the entire world. And I also still do a bit of teaching. So, yeah, I have a lot of experience with Ukraine. First of all, because my wife is Crimean and my mother-in-law still lives in Simferopol, the capital of Crimea. And we have family all over East Ukraine as well, family members in Kharkov, Donetsk, and Odessa. So I have probably more experience with Ukraine and Crimea than most Western reporters who write on the subject.
Yeah, and I think I'm trying to think when I first came across you on Twitter. I think I may have seen you on RT and then found you on Twitter,
Mm-hmm.
but your voice was one of the essential voices, I think, during the Maidan. Just to tell you where I'm at on this, I would tend to, back in, say, 2013, I would always tend to sympathize with a population, rising up to fight corruption or oppression or whatever else. So, and it was the Euromaidan. It was called the Euromaidan in the beginning. So I was inclined to sympathize with them at first. I was intensely interested in it. I had a long-term illness at the time, so I had more time on my hands than I ever wanted. So I was watching closely, and it was very hard to find any perspective that wasn't the American or European, you could say, propaganda, or at least slanted view in English, right? So there was you, and there was another guy. I don't remember his name, but he was a Brit, and he was in Eastern Ukraine at the time. So there were really only a few people who I ever found to get a different perspective on that.
Yeah, there were, a few others. Stephen Cohen was writing
Oh,
actively
yes, yeah.
at The Nation, of course, even then. And The Nation is not an insignificant magazine on the American liberal left. And Richard Sakwa, professor in the UK, professor of Russian studies, he actually wrote, I consider, the book on what happened in Ukraine during the Maidan Revolution / the openly West-backed Maidan Putsch in Kiev. And that is Frontline Ukraine. And you can find Richard Sakwa, and you can find that on Amazon. It's an excellent read. I think it is the definitive read on what has happened in Ukraine during the Maidan and since. And I would strongly recommend that book if you're really interested in getting into the subject.
Good. Thanks for mentioning that. And I'll include that in the show notes too, a link to that. But I guess the reason why I go back to this is because you can't understand this election without understanding what happened in 2014. And I was actually listening to Steve. That's when I began listening to Stephen Cohen every week. And you're right. That sort of that gave me some balance in understanding the situation. But even without that, just watching the situation, it just became, I don't know how to put it, but as I said, I started out being sympathetic to it. I'm inclined to side with protest movements if I think it's for the good of people. And at that point in time, I didn't really understand what was going on with the color revolutions and all that. So for a time, I sympathized with the Maidan protesters. In some ways I still do. The genuine grassroots protesters who were there, trying to do in what was one of the most corrupt countries in the world. But just a few
Still
weeks,
is.
yeah, maybe even worse. I don't know.
Yes.
But just a few weeks in, as I watched it, increasingly it didn't feel right. It got more violent, and frankly, like there was a sinister aspect to it. And some, at least that's the way I perceived it. And some of the protesters seemed to be more like malicious.
They
And
were.
and so I was watching this with a few friends, political allies online. And at one point, we saw some footage of an event inside like a large cavernous hall of some sort, and they were raising a Confederate flag. And we're like, what? Well, we thought that was odd. And and then we started. Then there were some signs of Nazi symbols. Some of them which I wasn't even familiar with, like I guess that. I
Wolf's
still don't.
Angel.
What is it again?
The Wolf's Angel.
Yeah, Wolf's Angle. And so at that point, that's the point when I found some English speakers online who were sort of anti-Maidan, who understood what was going on and offering a different perspective. And so at that point, we also got the leak of a telephone call where Victoria Nuland, who I don't think I was very familiar with her even until up to this point.
She was Obama's State Department's head of European and Eurasian affairs, showing her tact in that phone call towards the Europe that she was supposedly the liaison with by saying, F Europe, like openly during that phone call. So
F the EU. Yeah, maybe I'll include an audio clip here.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now, so we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think, in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking, in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tymoshenko and his guys. And, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yachts is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, I just think Cleach going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay, good. Well, do you want us to try to set up a call with him as the next step?
My understanding from that call, but you tell me, was that the big three were going into their own meeting, and that Yachts was going to offer in that context a three-way, the 3+1 conversation or 3+2 with you. Is that not how you understood it?
No, I mean, that's what he proposed, but I think just knowing the dynamic that's been with them where Klitschko has been the top dog, he's going to take a while to show up for whatever meeting they've got. He's probably talking to his guys at this point, so I think you reaching out directly to him helps with the personality management among the three, and it gives you also a chance to move fast on all this stuff and put us behind it before they all sit down and he explains why he doesn't like it.
Okay, good. I'm happy. Why don't you reach out to him and see if he wants to talk before or after?
Okay, will do. Thanks.
Okay, I've now written, one more wrinkle for you, Jeff.
Yeah.
Can't remember if I told you this or if I only told Washington this, that when I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. Did I write you that this morning?
Yeah, I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, fuck the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it. And again, the fact that this is out there right now, I'm still trying to figure out in my mind why Yanukovych that. But in the meantime, there's a Party of Regions faction meeting going on right now, and I'm sure there's a lively argument going on in that group at this point. But anyway, we could land jelly side up on this one if we move fast. So let me work on Klitschko, and if you can just keep. I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing. And then the other issue is some kind of outreach to Yanukovych, but we probably regroup on that tomorrow as we see how things start to fall into place.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deeds to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
Okay, great.
All right.
Thanks.
And of course, the spin on that story here was the fact that Victoria Nuland cursed. The fact that she said bad language. When the real story, that was a, what do you call it, a limited hangout if there ever was one, because the real story was she was picking and choosing who was going to be the next prime minister, right?
Absolutely. And she quite famously said during that telephone conversation, she was speaking to Jeffrey Piat, who was the U.S. Diplomat to Ukraine at the time, and they were talking about who their pick, who they were obviously pushing to be the next prime minister of Ukraine, which they saw the government as falling during the course of these protests, and they said Yats is our man, and they were talking about Yatsenyuk, who was one of the three big political, emerged eventually as one of the three big political leaders of the Maidan movement that overthrew the government of Viktor Yanukovych. And sure enough, of course, he did become the prime minister of Ukraine. He left office a couple of years ago in complete disgrace, one of the most hated political figures in the country, but his popularity then and when he left had very little, I think, to do with his assuming power in that regard at that time.
And so there was clearly a competition of sorts between the United States and the EU in terms of whose puppet was going to run the country.
Well, the thing about the Maidan movement, okay, first of all, the entire conflict then and the conflict now, it's best understood as a conflict of Ukrainian national identity. What does it mean to be a Ukrainian? Because, this is happening at the same time as nationalism is falling completely out of favor in Western Europe. Nationalism, originally a European ideology, the idea that a political state's borders should be congruent with one largely ethnically homogeneous population. The creation of a France where most people are speak French and identify as French, of course, and all the other countries in Europe, that was the result of hundreds and hundreds of years of fratricidal and genocidal warfare that began probably with the wars of Hispanic succession, all the way up through the 180 Years' War, the World War I, World War II, into the wars of Yugoslavia, and continue into Ukraine today. Because while the EU in the West has become a nation deconstruction machine now along its ideology of liberal cosmopolitanism, nationalism is actually supported and propped up, driven forward in East Europe by these same political forces, because in Eastern Europe it's seen as the necessary to manufacture nations, national identities, as long as the primary object of their national hatred is directed against Russia. And we see that, of course, in Poland, where there's definitely at least a long history of it, but in the Baltics and in Ukraine. And in Ukraine, there is a big identity divide that is not completely, but largely along geographic lines. East Ukraine, which has always been closer to Russia, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and so on. First of all, the population of ethnic Russians in Ukraine is around 24-25%, and that's heavily tilted towards the east. But even the Ukrainians and the other the minorities that live there, they're majority Russian-speaking, and they regard Russia as generally as a brother or sister people. So they don't seek a geopolitical conception of Ukraine where they view Russia as an enemy. It doesn't necessarily mean they're opposed to good relations and economic relations with the West, but they don't want to become an enemy of what they see as essentially their own people. I mean, the number of what is Ukrainian and what is Russian on both sides of the Ukrainian eastern border and Russian western border is really amorphous. The intermarriage, the long history together, even the historical question of what really is Ukraine as the border region of the Russian Empire. Of the Romanov Empire, anyway. It's really complicated, and particularly in East Ukraine, there is still a very nostalgic Soviet identity, a leftist identity as well. The Communist Party of Ukraine, before it was banned after the Maidan movement seized power, was the second largest political party in the country, largely represented in the East. The people in East Ukraine are often referred to as Slovaks, which is a derogatory statement about Soviet nostalgic leftists in Ukraine. West Ukraine, on the other hand, West Ukraine were often historically referred to as Galicia, which is the area around the cities of Lvov and Ternopil and others, wasn't, for a long period of history, wasn't even a part of Ukraine. It was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, then it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it only became part of Ukraine, formally, right during the World War II period, largely as a result of the actions of Stalin, of course. And they have a very anti-Russian conception of Ukrainian national identity. Not necessarily pro-Western or pro-European, not necessarily. But during World War II, famously, Western Ukraine, large numbers of people, the political organization, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, so OPA and OUN, which gave birth to the leader of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, Stefan Bandera. These were Ukraine's homegrown fascists, their homegrown fascist ideology. And they collaborated with Hitler during the German and East European invasion of the Soviet Union. And they were very fervent in carrying out the Holocaust in Ukraine, committing genocide, and not just collaboration, but being very active in the genocide of Jews and the ethnic cleansing and mass murder of Poles, and of course ethnic Russians and any type of leftist Ukrainians from Ukraine. And they are the political forces today that have control of Kiev, the Maidan government. They have declared that these genocidal Nazi collaborators are the founding fathers of Ukraine. the reason they continue to cling to this, everything in the country is being renamed after Bandera or other figures in these Nazi collaborating organizations, and they're being whitewashed and recast as nationalist defenders of Ukraine who fought the Soviets and then occasionally fought the Germans, although they also actively wore SS uniforms, and they carried out the Holocaust on German orders. And Bandera himself, after serving a brief time in a Nazi quote prison camp unquote for wanting to have a completely independent Ukraine, he then went back when he was released to fight for Nazi Germany in German uniform till the end of the war, all the way to Berlin. So the reason why they keep going back to these West Ukrainian fascists, these, you can call them Banderites, fascists, you can call them ultra-nationalists, is because in order to create a Ukraine and a conception of Ukrainian national identity that is completely split from and hostile to Russia, that is the only thing in Ukrainian history that they have to go to. So that they really have no recourse if they're so intent on creating a Ukrainian national identity that is separate and hostile to Russia. That's why, despite the occasional bad press, they get a result of that. And I mean, you have to look at the Maidan movement. First of all, it wasn't a unified movement, and the political unity collapsed almost as soon as they seized power. There were three big figures, these political figures. One of them was Arseny Yatsenyuk, who was politically related to Tymoshenko, and I guess you could call a soft nationalist and European leading.
Banker.
Yeah. A banker. The other leader was a boxer who then, after the Maidan, became the mayor of Kiev. And the third political party that was involved was Sloboda, or Freedom Political Party. And the leader of that party was Oleg Tyagnybok.
How do you pronounce that name again?
Yeah, the Russian tilt pronunciation is Oleg Tyagnybok. The Ukrainian pronunciation drops the G's for H's, so it's Oleg Tyagnybok. My Ukrainian is very bad, so forgive me for massacre.
I would have said like Chanabok, so sometimes I don't even try because these are just very hard to pronounce.
So if you take a look, now during the Maidan, of course, it was famous for the open, meddling does not begin to describe it. American and European political leaders, bureaucrats, politicians were flocking to Kiev and literally speaking to these, protesters and rioters, encouraging them to overthrow the Ukrainian government. And one of the ones that you repeat, of these three big political leaders that you repeatedly see pictures taken of him with John McCain, pictures of him with Victoria Nuland, pictures with Catherine Ashton, the foreign policy chief of the EU, is with Oleg Tyagnybok. Now, Oleg Tyagnybok, along with Andrei Parubi, who we'll get to in a moment, were the co-founders previously of the Social National Party of Ukraine, which anyone with any amount of honesty, particularly even before the Maidan, it admits is a neo-Nazi party. It's a fascist, anti-Semitic party.
Yeah.
It was rebranded as the Sloboda Party and became one of the three big, movements that became part of the Maidan. And this was the vanguard. These are the people who fought on the streets. Now, Sloboda wasn't the entirety of them. There were other ultra-nationalist and fascist factions as well, but they were the largest politically organized part.
Like the right sector is not
the right sector were their own. Largely adhered to the same ideology and conception, but had their own political leaders and separation.
They were connected to a different oligarch or something, right?
Well, they all had support from different oligarchs, but they had different political leaders.
Okay.
We'll say it that way.
Yeah, and we should probably explain that a little bit too, like how political parties in Ukraine are really centered around people. They're there's some leaders.
They're centered around either, the small ones are centered around, of course, charismatic individuals, cult of personality, and so far. But largely, politics in Ukraine is oligarchs of oligarchy. Which oligarch finances which party in which factions for which reason. Now, the thing about the Sloboda Party is just a year earlier, the European Parliament, the Parliament of the EU, had passed a resolution condemning the Sloboda Party in Ukraine as violent, anti-Semitic, racist, the whole line. I mean, this is literally condemning them by name specifically in a resolution, and said that anyone who had any intention of supporting democracy in Ukraine should have nothing to do with them.
Which is true, right? That's accurate.
A year later, European party leaders are having their photographs taken with Oleg Tyanibok because he promises to overthrow. He's part of a movement, the biggest fighters on the street for what would overthrow what was seen as a pro-Russian democratically elected government, the government of Viktor Yanukovych. The other leader of the Sloboda Party is Andrei Parubi. Well, he was the leader of the Social National Party. He split off from Sloboda. During the Maidan, he became the leader of what they called the self-defense forces of the Maidan.
He was the commandant, right?
He was the commandant. These were the fighters of the Maidan, the ones who captured government buildings, who fought the police back in the streets, and most people believe were in the ones who were involved in shooting both protesters and police, killing many on both sides in that final confrontation on the day before the government collapsed.
Right, and this is just for people who don't know. It's a martyring event that it sort of cements the coup, if you will. And there were snipers, and there's a lot of different stories on that story, but that's another subject, but an important one for people to know.
Do you know who Andrew Parubi is today?
Is he a defense minister of some sort?
He is the Speaker of the Rada.
He's the Speaker.
He's the second most powerful political figure in Ukraine. Andrew Parubi was feted by U.S. Congress, by the Canadian government, by the British government, and the man is as close to a political neo-Nazi in the world as they come.
There are pictures of him with John McCain.
Oh yeah, pictures with all sorts of the Atlantic Council, with Brookings and so on, and Max Blumenthal is one of the few American journalists who had the courage to confront and call him out and his beliefs, and the Ukraine that he's trying to create there. But a lot of times you'll hear them say, the people in the Ukrainian government, this idea that they're neo-Nazis and so on. Oh, yeah, there's a few people in battalions that, brought the government to power and supported it and all, but they're not fascists themselves. So of course, they never talk about people like Andrew Parubi.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the most suppressed. It's really amazing. It's one of the most suppressed aspects. Maybe you could even say it's one of the most suppressed stories of the decade, I would say.
They will just choose not to talk about him. They as much as possible, when Western journalists try to talk about Ukraine, they will go to great lengths to never talk about the Speaker of the Rada because of who he is, and and they something they can't really deny.
Now, what's Tyanibok doing right now?
He was basically retired from politics, from active leader, because his image was too well known and became too toxic. Parubi goes about it much more quietly, although actually much more dangerously.
Yeah, but there were like pictures of him all over the place with Nazi symbols and
Oh yes,
torch torch marches and things like
yeah.
that. And immediately in Yatsenyuk's government, so they brought one of these guys in as a defense minister of sorts, right?
Yeah, I mean, there have been a rotating number of defense ministers right now, but right now since the Maidan, the long-standing, for the last 5 years now, the head of the Interior Ministry of Ukraine, Avakov, Arsen Avakov. I mean, this is a guy who has been instrumental in bringing a lot of these ultranationalist and fascist battalions into parallel police and military structures and bringing them into the military itself. I mean, he's actively part of a Ukrainian hashtag Twitter campaign, Ya Bandera. I am Bandera. I am the genocidal Nazi collaborator, Stefan Bandera. So, I mean, when people try to, they try to detach, they say that this association of the Ukrainian government with ultranationalists, they'll never say the word Banderite fascist. It's all an instrument of Russian propaganda. They completely ignore people like this and what they say. And it's true that, the guy who became the leader of the Ukrainian, the putsch president, the oligarch Petro Poroshenko, who's running for re-election in Ukraine now. He is best known as a chocolate magnate. They call him, a billionaire. But that's only actually a partial of his holdings. He also, like all of the major oligarchs of Ukraine, he owns one of the major television stations and media outlets and continues to own it. He never divested himself of any of that when he became president. And it's true that Petro Poroshenko did not start out as a nationalist, as a Banderite. He was an opportunistic oligarch.
Yeah.
He had actually served in the previous government that he helped overthrow, the government of Viktor Yanukovych. He had served in the government before that and the government before that as well, using his positions to enrich himself at every time. But he has basically, because of the political movements after the Maidan, the infighting of the various political movements, he has now cast himself as the nationalists of nationalists. His campaign, his own party, he has his own party now. It's currently the largest party in Ukraine, although it won't be for very long. It's the Petro Poroshenko bloc. And his campaign is literally army language, meaning the Ukrainian language, and banning the Russian language, and faith, meaning he was instrumental in this separation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriot, the canonical long history of that relation. They're basically creating a separate Ukrainian National Orthodox Church that has, is causing no end of religious and political tension in Ukraine, and no small amount of violence as churches are seized and forcibly priests are removed to put these new priests in power. So,
can you explain the difference in power and function of the prime minister and the president in this country?
Yeah.
Maybe this isn't the right time to do it.
No. It's changed over time. Previously, the prime minister was a more powerful position, but since the Maidan ceased, where there has been some rewriting of the laws and the constitution, and the prime minister right now, who is a relatively, comparatively speaking, a moderate figure, a Jewish figure actually, of very loyal to Poroshenko, but a moderate. He is Poroshenko's creature, and there's never any political competition between the two of them. But he won't survive as a political figure after this election. It's very unlikely. So the prime minister of the Rada, of the Ukrainian parliament, was once a more powerful position. The second mainstream candidate in the Ukrainian election, other than this candy oligarch Petro Poroshenko, the current president who's running, is of course Yulia Tymoshenko.
Yeah.
And she has twice before, during the previous pro-Western revolution, the Orange Revolution, she was the prime minister. She is also an oligarch herself. She's known as the gas princess. She made her money by buying up Russian gas on the cheap and then reselling it in Ukraine and Europe for higher prices.
And for people who might not remember, you've probably seen her. She's sort of a beautiful middle-aged woman, and she's well known for her long blonde hair, which she wraps in a braid. She has sort of a signature.
That was her old signature look, right? This type of Princess Leia type Ukrainian folk braids. But the last couple of years, she completely dropped that look, and she's now kind of on a hipster, long-haired hipster thing right now. I mean, she's a powerful political force. She's kind of recast herself as a populist, and she is in intense political competition. It was still part of the Maidan, reordering of Ukrainian society, but against Poroshenko. She's recast herself as a populist, and her big campaign slogan is against the raising of gas and heating prices in Ukraine, which were one of the principal demands, largely undiscussed, of course, of the EU association agreement, which was the precipitating event of the whole Maidan putsch. In reality, it was a neoliberal shock therapy diktat, and it's also a demand of the IMF and the continuing loans that the West continues to prop up this regime in Ukraine with the use of massive, multi-billion-dollar IMF loans, which require the raising of domestic gas prices in Ukraine. And Ukraine is the people of Ukraine. It is the poorest per capita country in Europe.
Yeah, and it's a tragic history, and
yes.
The gas, which Ukraine has been a transport country, basically.
Yes.
For Russia, the Russian gas basically comes across Ukraine, and that's how it gets to Europe. This gave them a lot of sort of power and leverage, and they also
to extort low prices for themselves, or threaten to interrupt Russian gas contracts with Europe, which would inevitably then be blamed on Russia.
Right, and
this is why Russia has built Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, and now Turk Stream to the south, in order to stop this political blackmail over gas, because gas is big business between Russia and Europe. And Russia has, in the Soviet Union, and Russia has always actually been an extremely reliable energy provider to Europe. It's now providing some 37% of the EU's gas, and that's a number that keeps increasing by leaps and bounds a year as the EU tries to get away from coal. And that's why there's such actual business and political support in Germany for these projects, because they need Russian gas, and they don't have a problem working with the Russian state energy companies, but also to stop subsidizing the Ukrainian government. And it will be a huge blow to their economy when they're no longer used as a transit country.
And our, brilliant regime changers, they have a very simplistic view of, well, if these countries weren't so reliant on Russian gas, well, then, we can break their ties, and we can assert more influence. But what they didn't realize was that Russia had other options. They could go around Ukraine, and this leaves Ukraine, which had a largely subsidized energy situation for, I don't know, forever.
Yes.
So
well, it's even a little bit more than that, a little even more self-interest on the Americans' part, because ideally, and this is something promoted by Trump and others, America would like to sell gas obtained by fracking in the U.S. And sell it to Ukraine, to European countries in general, Germany and other European countries. Now, this, of course, would be in the form of liquefied natural gas. It has to be changed from a gas to a liquid at a U.S. port, shipped across the ocean, and then transformed at a European port, back into a gas, and then put into the European gas networks. And of course, this will always be multiple times, 2 to 3 times more expensive than gas that can cheaply and more quickly shipped via pipelines straight into Europe itself. So when the U.S. is trying to dictate, and they have threatened sanctions against European countries and companies that cooperate with Russia in building these pipelines, basically dictating Germany and the rest of Europe's energy security to them, and saying that, you should subsidize our economy and hurt your own economy by spending twice as much on our gas, rather than continuing to have a relationship with the Russians. And however much the Germans have gone along with America on so many other things, in the wake of this whole putsch and then conflict in Ukraine, they have not gotten the German businessmen to go along with that.
Right.
So it seems that despite all the screaming and blustering and threats of sanctioning their own allies, that Nord Stream 2 will be completed in short order as well. And Ukraine and Poland will stop both being important transit countries. At least Russia will always have options to go around.
I think the fracking industry also planned to expand into, I think there are some good potential areas of Ukraine. I think maybe
in East Ukraine, in the Donbass. They were looking at areas around there. That's also a coal-rich region, and Ukraine still depends for a lot of their energy that isn't provided by Russia on Donbass coal. So they've had a lot of problems there. And again, the fracking, the at least the idea that there might be potential for fracking in East Ukraine has gone out the door with the now frozen conflict in the east there.
But to get back a little bit to the whole idea of forcing Ukraine, away from Russia, and having it be, so closely integrated, as you mentioned. And Stephen Cohen used to talk about this, and he really helped people understand from the beginning that this situation of making Ukraine part of the EU, nobody really had a giant objection to that. It was the binary choice that was being forced on them that was the big issue. And the thing that Cohen used to say is, and I think he said that Putin was making this proposal, like, why does it have to be binary? Why can't they be part of the EU but continue their economic relationship with Russia at the same time, which actually would have been the best thing for Ukraine itself.
Everyone.
And the
well,
people.
for everyone, really, except that, of course, the whole goal of this all along was geopolitically to split Ukraine from Russia. I mean, it all goes back to this reductionist geopolitical theories of Mackinder, the heartland theory that Russia and Ukraine together encompasses the heartland of Eurasia and can become a threat to U.S. global power and so on. Those theories, I mean, there's a little bit of truth there, but it's largely reductionist. But Ukraine had an existing international, trade agreement with the Commonwealth of Independent States, the successor, loose successor, probably really best described as the organized divorce of the Soviet Union. But they had a free trade agreement with Russia and other former Soviet countries. And then this whole issue with the EU association agreement came along. Actually, membership in the EU was never actually discussed. It was this EU, and there are lots of countries have EU association agreements.
Dangled.
Turkey has one, right? Countries actually in the Americas have them and everything. But this was the strictest, largest, and most comprehensively reorganizing. This would have ripped Ukraine's laws legal system and economy and political system and its military associations down to nothing and then rebuild it up, down to the level where it dictated that train tracks in Ukraine had to be changed to match the train tread in Europe rather than in Russia. That's how, focused this was. And
which
Russia
has a military implication too.
Military implications, of course, as well, because a lot of military traffic in this part of the world is still done via trains, simply because of the convenience and the reliability of it.
So you could argue it's harder for, the way it's simplistically looked at is, Russia couldn't as easily invade Europe.
Yeah. The previous Ukrainian president, the one who was overthrown in the Maidan, was Viktor Yanukovych, and he was the leader. He was an oligarch himself, as nearly all Ukrainian politicians were. He was the leader of the Party of Regions, which was really a party of East Ukrainian oligarchs that rhetorically promised to represent the interest of East Ukrainians, and the Russian language in Ukraine. And again, the majority of Ukrainians speak Russian at home. This is a shock to most people. And it has long been, at least until the Maidan, the language of government, the language of academia, and everything there.
And Poroshenko himself, at times, has been caught on camera where he can't come up with the Ukrainian word.
Oh yeah. I mean, he's gotten better in the last couple of years, but certainly at the beginning, his Ukrainian was awful when he first became president. Not that mine is worse, of course, but he is supposedly the Ukrainian putsch president, at least. Now, Yanukovych is often presented as a pro-Russian leader, which is absolutely false to anyone who really knows anything about Russian, Ukrainian politics, and so on. The best that can be said of Yanukovych and the Party of Regions is that they weren't rabidly anti-Russian. And that is the redefinition. If you are not rabidly anti-Russian in the Western press, then you are pro-Russian. Mm-hmm. But he represented the interests not of Russia, but of East Ukrainian oligarchs, and to some extent, the East Ukrainian population. He, following the advice of the U.S. political advisor Manafort, who would later become involved in Trump, he actually pushed Yanukovych to try to govern Ukraine, not to his own base in the east of the country, but to the west, and push Ukraine. He is the one who campaigned for Ukraine to accept an EU association agreement. Yeah. He campaigned for it. He convinced part of his own base. Relentless, completely moronic propaganda promising it would be a paradise and all Ukrainians would be taking vacations on the Riviera and having enormous pensions and living lives of wealth once this all happened, which had no relation at all to the actual document, up until it was finally delivered to his desk as this neoliberal shock therapy diktat with no, take it or leave it terms. And if you don't take it, we'll come for you. But he was expecting billions and billions of dollars, tens of billions, from the EU and other countries to help support these neoliberal shock therapy reforms, which would see the majority of Ukraine's state-owned business privatized, sold off, and the unemployment of millions, the raising of energy and other utilities, the ends of subsidization of food prices, all this sorts of things that would have caused mass economic turmoil. And the truth is, even today, they have only begun to fulfill the terms of the EU association agreement. The new government that was supposedly brought together to enact this won't pass them because they know the political damage it would do. Because the people who don't know what is really in this document, for whatever reason, what was promised to them on TV and so on.
And what do they fear? Do they fear an uprising of the grassroots, or do they fear these militias that are going to actually, burn down the Rada?
Yeah, the militias are not so much economically orientated as ideologically.
Right.
That if they move away from the nationalists themselves are not really pro-European. not the EU Europe anyway. They do hark, of course, to the Europe of the far right organizations and everything. But the Maidan was composed of two actually quite different groups whose only unity was that they didn't like Russia. One is the pro EU liberal, largely youth from the center and the west of the country. And then at least equal, sometimes greater numbers were the very large number of this far right Ukrainian ultranationalists like Banderite fascists. And that loose alliance between these two forces, continues into the government of today. And the thing they had in common was moving away from Russia and politically neutering the east of the country. And so they don't necessarily support the EU association agreement. And back to the point you made that Russia, the Ukrainian president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, and Russia told Europe, let's all sit down together and work out a trade deal, that Ukraine could have good trade relations with both Europe and Russia. And they did this 3 times, and Europe, the EU, specifically denied that every time, saying Ukraine, literally, their words were, Ukraine needs to make a civilizational choice, which shows you the geopolitical intentions of all of this. And, it has led directly to the conflict and the 10,000 plus dead that you have seen in Ukraine, up till today, because you tried to make a identity and to some extent ethnicity divided country make this choice. You tried to force them to it. Ukraine could have existed for a long time, as a neutral bridge even between Russia and Europe, but that wasn't acceptable to Europe.
Why was that? Do you understand?
Yeah, geopolitics. It's all geopolitics. It all comes back to a very reductionist understanding that a separation of Russia and Ukraine is necessary to prevent Russia from ever becoming organizing the Eurasian space, whether through the Eurasian Economic Union or the Collective Security Treaty Organization or even the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that could threaten Western global hegemony. Whether you're talking in economic terms or military terms, it all just comes down to this very reductionist geopolitical thought that a Russia and Ukraine separate and hostile to each other will prevent Russia from ever becoming a threat again. Whether that results in a destabilized and weakened Ukraine is not important to them.
Yeah, they don't care. And I guess Brzezinski has sort of ingrained this thought into all the Western foreign policy establishment that he called Ukraine the prize.
And this isn't something new. I mean, back in the 1950s, the U.S. was supporting the grandfathers of these people in Western Ukraine today. They were then known as the Forest Brothers, and these were West Ukrainian fascists who had fought on the side of Hitler and continued a guerrilla war in Western Ukraine, well into the Cold War, and the U.S. dullists at the time referred to them as our fascists. Yeah. I mean, this is nothing new. There's a long history of this here, and that's why Western quiet support with a wink and a nod of this, isn't changed. But I guess we should go back to the actual election that's coming out.
Yeah. Because there are parallels, actually, to, I didn't realize until we just talked about the original 3 Maidan superstars, that the 3 candidates today, there's kind of some parallels there. But anyway, so let's talk about the 3 candidates now. We have Poroshenko, the incumbent. We have
the oligarch president who's running on this nationalist army language faith.
And in a very precarious situation. He's got
precarious situation. His approval rating was down as low as 9% in just a few months ago. He's now, through this provocation in the Azov Sea and this division of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, He's actually doubled his numbers. But the man has a 77% disapproval rating.
Ooh.
Right? Making him practically unelectable nationwide unless if something happens, right?
Did that provocation work? That the Azov
it doubled his numbers from 9 to 18%. So yeah, it did work to an extent. You've got Yulia Tymoshenko, this other Maidan figure, the gas princess. She's running this populist ticket against Poroshenko, but within the Maidan, larger framework. And
is she like the Hillary Clinton of Ukraine?
Yeah. I mean, you can make those parallels based on the fact that she's a blonde woman and does have a certain type of charisma, but her disapproval rating is also 64%, and a lot of people in the country hate her. She's got a really mixed history. When she was prime minister, she did a bunch of very murky energy deals with Russia that said a lot of money siphoned off in Ukraine to various oligarch figures that she represented, very murky deals. She actually was sent to prison for that during the presidency of Yanukovych, something that was actually largely political. There were lots of good reasons to send her to prison. That probably wasn't one of them.
It seemed like she was going to be the hero that returns.
She was already dated at that point, and most people in Maidan, while they supported having her freed, they didn't actually want her to return to politics because she's seen as such a. I mean, she's someone that Putin did business with, and they hate her. Whether you're talking the pro-EU liberals or the ultra-nationalists, a lot of them hated her for it. So she is, again, she also kind of like a Madonna figure. She keeps trying to reinvent her image and her platform, but she is a very ambitious political creature, just like Poroshenko, and she's reinvented this populist preaching against the high gas prices that are dictated by the IMF and the EU Association Agreement. No word of how she would get out of that. She was the front runner up until a few months ago. Since the events of the last few months, Poroshenko has probably taken some votes away from her. The ultra-nationalist vote, the pro-ultra-nationalist vote in the country is split between the two of them, with different ultra-nationalist battalions and the oligarchs supporting them, backing each one. But the big story of the Ukrainian elections right now is the dark horse protest vote candidate. Now, a recent Gallup poll shows that Ukrainians' confidence in their government is the lowest in the world for the second year in a row. 9% of Ukrainians express confidence in their government. Just 9%. After 9%, after what we were told in the Western mainstream media was a popular revolution of dignity. That's what we were told. Now, there were actually polls taken during the Maidan, reported in the pro-American and American-owned, at the time, Kiev Post newspaper that writes in English in Kiev. There were 3 polls, during the months of the Maidan, and they showed that, support for the Maidan in the country was significant, but it actually wasn't the majority, that a slim majority in the country was actually against the Maidan, 51-45, 48-45, but we're against the Maidan. And they had about half the country backing them, but they had more than half, just over half the country against it, which is why there's a civil conflict in Ukraine that continues until today. But this dark horse candidate is a comedian, and the old story about first time is tragedy, second time is farce. A Russian-speaking Jewish comedian, Volodymyr Zelensky. He is from East Ukraine. He's from an industrial city in the Dnipropetrovsk region.
Oh.
Don't assume too much from that.
Okay.
He is young. He's only 41 right now. He began a comedian project, Kvartal, like Office 95. He became he starred in, these comedy routines, a number of romantic comedies, including he was in a movie, Love in the Big City 2, which was a Russian film, which is now banned in Ukraine because they ban all kinds of culture, musicians, artists, anything from Russia is now banned in Ukraine by the regime there now. So one of the presidential candidate's own movies is banned in Ukraine, right? But his big thing, how he came to the most recent prominence, is he has starred in a television series running a couple years now called The Servant of the People, where he plays a Ukrainian school teacher from a small town that, after a rant which is posted to the internet, goes viral against corruption and the political events in the country, he ends up running for and becomes president as kind of a Mr. Smith goes to Washington type of honesty and political naivety. And this is, again, there's similarities to the U.S. where a reality star becomes the president. Here, a comedian who played a fictional president may just become the president of Ukraine. And he has now emerged actually as the frontrunner by a significant degree. And the series is called The Servant of the People. It's also the name of his political party. And you can actually watch the series on Netflix right now. And if you really want to find out, as much as anyone knows, who this guy is and what at least the image he's presenting to Ukrainians as what he would be like as a president, you can watch it for yourself on Netflix. A Servant of the People.
When did this series start?
2 years ago. We're into the third series now.
I mean, this looks like a brilliant political plot.
See, now here's where the conspiracy, well, maybe not even conspiracies, come from. One of the other big Ukrainian oligarchs, remember, as I said again, Ukrainian politics is always about oligarchs. Unlike Russia, which had Putin, who drove the oligarchs out of politics, Ukraine has never had that. It's continually about the oligarchs. One of the other big oligarchs in the Ukraine, who originally supported the Maidan, Igor Kolomoisky.
Yeah, and he's maybe one of the most interesting oligarchs.
He's an interesting man, an interesting figure, corrupt to the bone and not shy about it. He used to own Private Bank, which was the largest bank in Ukraine, but that has since been renationalized by the government after he had a political falling out after the Maidan with Poroshenko.
Yeah, I mean, this is the last thing I remember about Kolomoisky is he's they're raiding his offices because he basically owns this one province and
he was made governor, like diktat governor of Kharkov by Poroshenko following the Maidan to prevent a Russian Spring Revolution in this eastern, largely pro-Russian city. And even Foreign Policy magazine was crowing about how Kolomoisky cut deals with the Kharkov mafia to beat down the pro-Russians on the streets and prevent them from rising up there. And he was also one of the big backers, financial backers, of many of these ultra-nationalist battalions who did the fighting in the early days of the Maidan and in the Donbass, and then have since become integrated into the country's police and military formations. But he had this falling out. He's since been spending most of his time in Israel, but he owns one of the big television stations, probably the biggest in Ukraine, 1+1, which is the network that Zelensky's show, Servant of the People, and a lot of his other entertainment has all appeared on. So there's a lot of people who believe that Zelensky is a creature, maybe entirely a kind of fourth mirror creation of Kolomoisky, that it's actually, him running as president. I can't attest to that at all. I have no idea. I do know that Kolomoisky is using his television station to promote Zelensky at every opportunity. In fact, during the past month, Ukraine has had Saturdays as days of silence, where you're not allowed to do any political campaigning. And during those days, Kolomoisky's channel has run 24 hours of Zelensky's comedy routines and movies and TV shows. And it was on that station on New Year's Eve, just before the annual presidential address by the president. It's a kind of a New Year's message to the people that happens in Russia and Ukraine. That was preempted on Kolomoisky's channel by Zelensky coming on, imitating himself actions actually in that TV show, and declaring his candidacy for president, which catapulted attention. So there are good arguments to be made of the connections between Zelensky and Kolomoisky. No one knows what Zelensky is currently at least 10 points above Poroshenko, and perhaps slightly more than that above Tymoshenko. There's 39 candidates in this election. But only 3 of them matter. And that's Zelensky, the dark horse protest vote comedian, Petro Poroshenko, the current president oligarch, of the Maidan, running on this nationalist, and this populist, gas princess turned populist, Yulia Tymoshenko. And the numbers are 32, 17, 14, 24, 22, 14. Most of the polls have Zelensky about 10 points up. Now, here's the thing. If no one candidate, which seems almost assured, gets over 50% of the vote, then the 2 top candidates compete in a second round of elections 3 weeks later. The election is tomorrow in Ukraine, which is March 31st. So the second round of elections, which will actually determine who becomes president probably, will be on April 21st, 3 weeks later. And that will either almost certainly be Zelensky against Poroshenko or Zelensky against Tymoshenko. And right now, the polls show that it will probably be Zelensky against Poroshenko. And again, the polls show that both of these head-to-head matchups will result in Zelensky winning. But anything could happen. Poroshenko could create another provocation, and so on. No one knows. No one knows how Zelensky will govern. He's running on a type of anti-political post-modern campaign organized mostly through social media. He doesn't do campaign speeches. He does comedy routines where he continues his comedy routines where he makes a few political jokes at his politicians at his opponent's expense. He is running on an anti-corruption campaign largely, but that's how the Maidan in some ways called itself when it emerged to power and became more corrupt. Every government since Ukrainian independence has been corrupt. Of course, they all say they're against corruption, whether they actually will be or not. Of course, he'll be a complete political novice. He'll have no support in the Rada whatsoever because he doesn't even have a party there yet. That could change. In 6 months, there are elections in the Rada, and a big success, him taking the presidency, could allow him to sweep the Rada, a lot of his own people into it. But we don't even know who his own people are at this point, and I think he does. He's promising to make a lot of big decisions in Ukraine based on popular referendums. And I think you can take a look at Brexit in the UK or multiple referendums in Europe whose results have been ignored when the people voted the wrong way, like the Lisbon Treaty in Ireland and so on, and say that maybe that's not actually such a smart idea in such a divided country.
It probably won't happen. Yeah.
Well, he probably will try it if he gets elected. How successful it will be, I'm more skeptical about. And he's promising to install term limits, only serve for one term himself, and get rid of parliamentary and presidential immunity. But he's very vague on anything to do with foreign policy, how to deal with this conflict in the Donbass or to deal with Russia. He's still at least giving lip service to Ukraine joining NATO and the EU, but no one's really sure what he will do when he get in office. Very policy light at this point.
Does he say anything about Crimea?
Yeah, he did. He said that, well, Crimea and the Donbass, he actually said, won't return to Ukraine until there is a change in power in Russia and a change in hearts in the Crimea and Donbass, which you could read one way and you could read another. You could read it as he knows there's not going to be any military solution. It's also denying, of course, the very strong reality of the support of the Crimean people, as my wife and family there can attest to, for the reunification with Russia. So it would be political suicide at this point, though, for any Ukrainian politician to say, oh, well, Crimea and Donbass aren't ours anymore. That would be political suicide for any politician. So, of course, that's not something to be said. But there's something I want to say about these, quote, elections. Now, it is commonly understood in the West that an election under the barrel of a gun is not a free election. Well, that's been every election in Ukraine since, the Maidan putsch, since they overthrew the last legitimate democratically elected president there, Yanukovych, however flawed he was. That continues to this day, not just under the barrel of a gun, but literally under shelling by Grad artillery shells. The jackboot of these ultra-nationalist battalions, whether they're at the street level, incorporated in the parallel institutions to the police now as the National Druzina, or in the military. This frozen conflict in the East continues to this day. And, how can you have an election that has any national legitimacy under those terms, especially when the East is the part of the country that is politically and always was politically resistant to the Maidan to begin with. And the biggest parties of the country before the Maidan, and the ones that represented East and South Ukraine, the Party of Regions and the Communist Party of Ukraine, well, they were all lustrated, banned, and pogromed out of existence. The Party of Regions lustrated, the Communist Party and two other leftist parties completely banned. And this was done for a purpose, because they know that in order to politically reorganize itself as a force, the East and South of the country, it will take decades now that they've banned and lustrated and pogromed these two parties. So they have carte blanche to remake Ukraine politically with very little political resistance in their own image, in a pro-Western geopolitical and identity-wise ultra-nationalist orientation. This is quite intentional after the failed results of the Orange Revolution. And, we have parties banned that aren't allowed to run, that were once the largest parties in the country. You have, politicians, in the last elections trying to go to debates, candidates from the East who were beat repeatedly by these ultra-nationalist thugs associated with the Maidan, when they tried to, go to debates and have their voice heard. The houses of their family members, the leader of the Communist Party saw his son's house be burned down in the last elections. And, that's the climate, of course, that's still going forward into this election. One of the biggest of these ultra-nationalist battalions, which has become a big social, not quite political movement, but social movement as well, that it doesn't have huge support politically, like at the voting booth across the country, but has a very active minority who support it, kind of like the William Butler's Yeats poem, The Second Coming. The best lack all conviction, and the worst are filled with passionate intensity. And this is the Azov battalion, who uses the Wolf's Angel as their symbol. They a lot of their members have been incorporated into the National Druzhina, a National Guard-like formation that is a parallel organization created to the police. They are the election monitors across.
What?
Yes, fascist, literal, beat people and kill people on the street. Fascists are the election monitors for this election. So
because I see in Al Jazeera it says 967 registered international observers will monitor the vote. And I was thinking, okay, international. So that can't be, this is different.
Yeah. I mean, no, of course, those are international observers. But,
so these guys are at the polling station.
Those are at the polling stations.
Okay.
Jackboots glaring at everyone as they come in the door, right?
Oh, my God.
Now, and the OSCE itself is, of course, a completely political and geopolitical organization. They will never tell you in their assessment of this election that there is still a conflict in the East and that it is literally at people voting under the barrel of a gun and a rocket launcher, or about all the parties that have been banned that were once the largest parties in the country, the parties that almost completely represented the East and the South, the parts of the country that were against the Maidan. They won't tell you any of this. They will tell you, it's free and fair and competitive elections. Well, it is competitive because you don't know who's going to win. It could be this dark horse Zelensky comedian, possibly supported by the oligarch Kolomoisky. It could be the oligarch Poroshenko. It could be the oligarch, the gas princess Tymoshenko. Any of those things are possible. But to call this a free and fair election is a sick joke.
Yeah, it's like rigging the primaries,
It's just assuming how dumb your audience is. Well, I mean, it goes far beyond rigging the primaries. It's actually killing your opponents and banning them.
Violently rigging them. Yeah. Now, will the polling will there be polling stations in Donetsk and in the eastern part of Ukraine, or no?
Not in the part that is controlled by the separatists / loyalists, whatever you want to call them. But actually, those, the separatists, as they call them in the Western media, they actually only control 1/3 of the area of the respective Donetsk and Lugansk republics, the big cities, Donetsk and Lugansk, but not the majority of those regions. So there will be voting in the Donbass, but not in the area controlled by the governments. There will also, of course, not be any voting in Russia. And despite, Russia being the aggressor nation, there are over 1 million Ukrainians who fled East Ukraine to Russia for safety, many of them becoming Russian citizens, others accepting various forms of residency. And there are some 3 million Ukrainians out of a total population of about 48 million, so not an insignificant part of the population living and working in Russia. And they, of course, won't be allowed to vote in the election either, which, of course, is all meant to increase Poroshenko's vote total. Poroshenko will get most of his votes from the West. Tymoshenko will get most of her votes from the East, and most of them will be competing for both the older vote and the nationalist vote. Meanwhile, this protest vote comedian Zelensky, he is seeing a lot of support in the South, some in the East, and he's seeing the majority of support from young people, which are the most politically active, but are also the least reliable to turn out in any country for the actual voting on election day. So there's a lot of assumptions of what are going to happen. Also, all the polls show that 20 to 25% of the Ukrainian population hasn't made up their mind. And I would expect once again in the East to see total turnout probably less than 50%, because this Gallup poll that showed that only 9% of Ukrainians have confidence in their government also showed that only 12% of Ukrainians believe that this will be a fair and honest election.
Yeah, I saw that.
So the East doesn't feel they're politically represented. And as far as they're politically represented in the country, they will probably vote for this comedian as a protest vote, saying, well, to hell with politics and everything that's happened in the country since then. And it's possible that Zelensky could win if things are honest, if there's not another military provocation by Poroshenko in the 3 weeks after the first round. But covering their bases, the representatives of the U.S. State Department and the diplomatic office in Kiev have met with Zelensky every week for the past 2 months.
Now, Kolomoisky.
That's not meddling, of course.
Right,
not
right.
meddling.
I mean, clearly Poroshenko's our man. But Kolomoisky, like, if I remember correctly, he was banned from this country for a period of time, but he would show up at like NBA basketball games. Am I remembering that correctly?
I don't remember that Kolomoisky was ever banned from. I could be wrong on that, but I don't remember that.
I made up the wrong guy, and if I do, I'll just cut this out. But
no, there have been some other that have some connections with Russia who were probably banned, but I don't think Kolomoisky. Kolomoisky is far too loved in Israel for him. I mean, and I have nothing against the Jews are a vital part of the society and political establishment in Ukraine, whether we're talking the candidate Zelensky. But my hatred of oligarchs has nothing to do with whether they're Jewish or not. I just don't like oligarchs.
Yeah, I mean, I thought Kolomoisky, when he left or fled the country, I thought he left with like $2 billion, some of it IMF bailout money and some of it American aid.
That was what he was, accused of looting from the agreements, the international agreements that were shoveling money into Ukraine through private bank. But his fortune is much larger than that and has parts of it stashed away in tax havens and countries around the world. I can assure you of that.
Yeah, and I would think that I would think that would have been a big story at that time, although there were a lot of big stories at that time.
They've become so inured to corruption and the power of the oligarchs at this point, where it's become part of their daily lives. They don't even react to it.
And then
they usually just pick sides and say my oligarch versus their oligarch.
So cult of personality kind of thing. Yeah. Now, lastly, it's important, the militias. Poroshenko, the militias are at least loosely on Poroshenko's side, right?
No, there's a division of them. Between Poroshenko, well, first of all, they all have their own political ideology, and they don't necessarily agree with the pro-NATO, pro-European direction, except as a bulwark against Russia and the pro-Russian Ukrainians and ethnic Russians in Ukraine itself. And at the core, they're always most loyal to their own cadres and their own ideology, but support wider political support, as in the sense of, the eternal democratic choice of voting for the lesser of two evils, has started to divide between people who say, nationalists who say we would rather see Poroshenko as president, and those who say they would rather see Tymoshenko as president. I think the majority of them might swing towards Poroshenko, but there's talk that Azov is tilting more towards
Zelensky?
Tymoshenko. Tymoshenko, as is the current interior minister, Avakov, the one who is tweeting out "Ya Bandera," I'm Bandera. So there's a division between the two mainstream Maidan candidates and which of these three figures they would prefer to see as president. Again, you will hear lots of Western Russia and Ukrainian experts tell you that because their own particular political parties, like the right sector, like the National Guard that Andrei Belitsky, the former leader of Azov, who is now a Rada member, that because their own political parties only get 2 or 3% on the actual voting booths, that they're not actually part of the Maidan government and so on. That's absolutely ridiculous because, like, our Andrei Poruby, the former leader, founder of the Social Nationalist Party of Ukraine, who's the Speaker of the Rada, he didn't run on a nominally far right party. He ran on Yatsenyuk's party. And it's the same thing with multiple of these figures. They have become filtered through all of the Maidan parties so that you get them, whether you vote directly for, the organization's own little unique political party or one of the bigger parties itself. The one thing that I haven't heard is that any of the battalions, the ultranationalist battalions, are supporting Zelensky. And
yeah, that's a curious
it would be a
thing.
pretty hard sell to have them support a Russian-speaking Jew as the president. So currently, whatever funding Kolomoisky may or may not have done in the past of them, there are currently no ultranationalists battalions supporting Zelensky. And I would expect them to back, at least in the second round, anyone but him for president, if only because they don't know what he would do. Although it has to be noted that Zelensky's comedy troupe that became his political organization, Kvartal 95, donated money to the Ukrainian army, and probably meaning the Ukrainian battalions at the time, during the beginning of the Donbass conflict.
Yeah. Well,
but
listen,
he has also said that the current government came to power in blood and maintains power by blood as well. So we don't know what he's going to do if he actually becomes president, or how much he will be able to get done without any political support in the Rada.
Yeah, that's curious, to say the least. Well, listen, I've kept you a long time. I did want to, and maybe we can continue this conversation at another time, because it is a very interesting story.
We'll have 3 weeks between tomorrow and the second round of the election. I would be glad.
That would be great if you could come back.
My last word to anyone listening out there: read Richard Sakwa's Frontline Ukraine, and watch Volodymyr Zelensky's Servant of the People on Netflix, and see the guy the comedian protest vote who just may become the next president of Ukraine.
Pretty amazing. And how can people find your work and support your work, Mark?
I'm very active on Facebook and Twitter, plus I'm continually on RT, CGTN, Press TV, and other media outlets.
Okay, let's talk again in the middle of April after the runoff election.
Sure. Thanks for having me, John.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Mark Sleboda. Follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Sleboda1 and on Facebook, and look for his appearances on RT and other international channels. Around the Empire podcast, listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please help me build out the YouTube channel by subscribing. That's free. youtube.com/c/aroundtheempire, and follow on Twitter at Around the Empire. The audio podcast has been the main focus for Around the Empire. It's where we have the most traffic, and there are many ways to listen to it. Find it, subscribe on your favorite podcast app, or listen to it on the website, aroundtheempire.com, or on patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on YouTube, youtube.com/c/aroundtheempire. If you're listening to this on YouTube, hit the thumbs up to like the video. Leave me a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. I'm working on a new look and new kinds of content, including video live streams, mini docs, and the like, and I really need your help to build up that YouTube channel. We'll see you next time. Take care, everyone. Peace.